My name is Julian Cross. I just returned to the country after a long stint overseas, a kind of self-imposed exile where the days blurred into one another, a rhythm of coffee shops in Berlin and conference rooms in Vienna, the constant hum of new ideas and old regrets. It felt good to be back on familiar ground, to walk the streets where I'd first learned who I was meant to be. Catherine had insisted on this coffee date at our old haunt, a little place near her apartment that smelled like cinnamon and second chances. We sat near the window, sunlight pooling between us, 2 mugs of steaming coffee between our hands, and for the first time in months, I felt a flicker of home. She smiled the way she always did, with that small curve of her lips that made everything else fade. Her hand brushed mine, and for a second, I thought maybe the world had shrunk down to just us. Until Ivy walked in. She arrived in a rush of floral perfume and clicking heels, her hair pulled into a sleek ponytail that made her look older than she was. She carried her latte like it was a gavel, ready to pronounce judgment on anyone within earshot. She barely spared me a glance before she set her sights on Catherine, her sister, my Catherine. Her voice, sharp, crisp, sliced through the soft cafe chatter like a surgeon's scalpel. "Catherine," she said, her tone full of practiced exasperation, "you're too nice. He's jobless. A NEET. These types are the scum of society." She didn't even lower her voice. Heads turned. A barista froze mid-pour. The sound of the espresso machine hissed like a snide laugh in the background. For a second, I couldn't breathe. The word, NET, echoed in my head, a label I'd carried before but never from her lips, never from someone who mattered to Catherine. It wasn't true, of course, but that didn't make it hurt any less. Catherine's face went pale, her eyes darting between me and Ivy as if she could physically shield me from the words. But it was too late. Ivy's high heels clicked on the floor like the ticking of a countdown, her latte in hand as she turned and walked away, leaving the aftermath in her wake. The cafe went silent. I could feel every pair of eyes on me, like I was the main act in a tragic play. Catherine reached for my hand, but I pulled away gently, not out of anger, but because I needed a second to process, to figure out how to smile through this without breaking. I took a slow breath and then forced the corners of my mouth up, a reflex I'd learned to master in places where respect wasn't given freely. "It's fine," I said, though my chest felt tight. "She's your sister. She's just concerned." The words tasted bitter. Catherine's eyes shimmered with something between apology and helplessness, like she wished she could crawl into the space between us and erase the hurt. "But there are some things even love can't shield you from. Julian," she whispered, her voice cracking just a little, "I'm so sorry. She doesn't know." I stopped her with a raised hand, my smile now more armor than warmth. "She's protective. I get it. Let's not let it ruin our day." But even as I said it, I knew the day was already marked. I felt like I was standing on a stage I hadn't auditioned for, lines I hadn't rehearsed, with Ivy as the director and everyone else as her captive audience. I hated the way it made me feel, like I had to prove something to a world that had no idea who I was or what I'd survived to get here. The truth was, I'd worked damn hard overseas. I'd seen things, learned things, earned respect in rooms where no one knew my name. I'd built a reputation, Julian Cross, the surgeon who never flinched, who handled impossible cases with a steady hand. I'd been a resident, a fellow, a trusted pair of hands in places where language barriers couldn't stop a heartbeat from restarting under my care. But none of that was written on my forehead. None of that was tattooed on my skin. Here, all Ivy saw was a man who'd stepped off a plane with a duffel bag and a smile, no visible job title to wear like a shield. I watched Catherine as she fumbled with her napkin, tearing it into thin white strips, her eyes darting around like she wanted to disappear. I knew that look, the way guilt settles into your bones, makes you feel like you owe everyone an explanation. I leaned forward, my voice low and steady, the way I'd talk to a patient on the verge of panic. "Hey," I said, catching her gaze. "Don't do that. Don't let her words sit in your chest like poison. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I thought she might let them fall. But she blinked them away, her lips trembling into a small, determined smile. "I know," she whispered. "I know who you are." And that was enough for now. I took a sip of my coffee, letting the bitterness ground me, reminding me of all the nights I'd spent with nothing but caffeine and determination to keep me company. I thought of the surgeries I'd performed, the hours I'd logged, the lives I'd touched. I was not an NET. I was not a scum of society. I was Julian Cross, and I'd earned every scar on my hands. Ivy didn't know me, but she would. One day, she'd understand the man sitting across from her sister in a small cafe, smiling through the pain because he loved her more than his pride. One day, I'd make sure of it. Until then, I'd hold on to Catherine's hand and remind myself that love, real love, wasn't built on titles or labels. It was built on the quiet moments where two people chose each other, over and over again. And right now, that's what mattered most. We met during entrance exams at Bramwell Medical College, and from the moment I saw her, I knew she was different. She was standing there in the hallway, a gentle smile lighting up her entire face, her eyes warm and curious, as though the chaos of the day, the tension, the last-minute cramming, the anxiety that clung to all of us like sweat, didn't faze her at all. I, on the other hand, was a mess. My pen was leaking ink, my tie was crooked, and the one thing I'd forgotten in my meticulous prep, the eraser, felt like the final straw that might break me. That tiny, stupid eraser. The weight of every entrance exam, every sacrifice my family made, every sleepless night on borrowed textbooks, all of it bore down on me as I rummaged through my bag, the panic rising like bile. That's when she appeared beside me, holding out her own eraser with a smile that seemed to slow time. "We're in this together, right?" she said, her voice so calm it felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. And in that instant, the tension in my chest eased. I don't know how she knew I needed that kindness, but it was like she'd read the fear in my eyes and decided it wasn't something I had to carry alone. Her name was Catherine Bell. That eraser changed everything. We ended up sitting next to each other in the exam hall, and every time I felt my confidence falter, I'd glance over at her. She'd flash that same smile and give a tiny nod, like we were partners in this battle. By the time the final paper was collected, I knew I'd met someone who would change the course of my life. And she did. Orientation came next, a blur of lectures, case studies, and late-night study sessions that bled into early morning clinical rounds. We stuck together, gravitating toward each other in a way that felt both natural and inevitable. Our friendship deepened with every coffee shared in the hospital cafeteria, every meal we squeezed in between classes, every time we walked home together in the rain because neither of us wanted the day to end. She made me laugh in the middle of a cadaver lab, made me feel like I was more than just a student chasing a white coat. She saw the person behind the grades, behind the ambition. And slowly, I realized I couldn't imagine my days without her. I changed because of her. I ditched the second-hand blazers and outdated shoes, traded them for shirts that actually fit and shoes that didn't squeak with every step. I started hitting the gym, if only so I could keep up with the way her eyes sparkled every time we passed each other in the corridor. I sharpened my mind too. My notes were meticulous, my study plans ironclad. I was determined to be the kind of man she deserved, even if she didn't know it yet. Every exam became a challenge I had to win. Every clinical rotation a chance to prove I wasn't just another name on the roster. And at the center of it all was Catherine, her quiet encouragement pushing me forward like a steady pulse. She was there for the wins, the A's on my report cards, the commendations from the professors. But she was also there for the failures, the days when I felt like the weight of the world was too much. She'd show up at my apartment with takeout and a grin, curling up on my threadbare couch, reminding me that no grade was ever going to define who I was. The night we finally kissed wasn't planned. We'd been studying late, some complicated cardiac case I can't even remember now. It was humid, the air heavy with the threat of rain. We were walking along the seawall near campus, the salt air mixing with the scent of rain-soaked asphalt, when I stopped. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode. I turned to her and said, "I can't keep pretending I don't feel this." "Catherine," but I didn't get to finish. She stepped closer and kissed me, soft and sure, like she'd been waiting for me to gather the courage. When we pulled apart, I couldn't stop smiling. She laughed, tucking her hair behind her ear, her eyes bright with something I'd never seen before, something that looked like hope. "I've been waiting for you to say it," she whispered. And that was it. The last barrier between us crumbled. We were inseparable after that. Study sessions blurred into late-night ramen runs and whispered confessions. We'd sit on the hood of my beat-up car, talking about everything and nothing. The future, our fears, our dreams of saving lives and making a difference. I told her about my mother's sacrifices to get me here, about the nights I'd slept on the clinic floor just to afford tuition. She told me about her father's expectations, about the way she felt she had to be perfect all the time, even when she didn't know how. We shared the parts of ourselves we kept hidden from everyone else, and somehow, it made me believe that we could face anything. We graduated together. Top of the class, both of us. Her parents beamed at the ceremony, their pride radiating in every polite nod and forced smile. My mother sent me a text with a dozen heart emojis and a reminder that she'd always believed in me. I looked at Catherine, her hand wrapped around mine, and thought, I'm the luckiest man in the world. We made plans, residency, fellowships, the long road to becoming the surgeons we'd always dreamed of being. But life isn't a neat timeline of successes and celebrations. Even then, there were shadows on the horizon, hints of the battles we'd have to fight, both inside and outside the hospital walls. But in that moment, with Catherine's eraser still tucked away in a box of memories I kept like talismans, I believed we could overcome anything. Because that eraser wasn't just a borrowed tool, it was a promise. A promise that we'd always be in this together, no matter how hard the days got, no matter how sharp the world's edges felt. I held on to that promise then. I still do. Catherine adored her sister, but Ivy never adored me. Not even a little. From the first time I met her at the Bell family's house, a place that smelled like polished oak and expectations, I knew I'd never win her over with charm alone. Ivy was sharp, ambitious, the type who calculated every move like she was already halfway to the top of the ladder, even if she was still finishing her internship at Westbridge University Hospital. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who always had an answer, someone who'd never needed a lifeline or a second chance. Her eyes, a darker shade than Catherine's, assessed me the way a surgeon assesses a wound, objectively, clinically, as if she could see every weakness beneath my skin. She tolerated me at first, the way you tolerate a late train or a dull conversation, annoying but temporary. But the moment she found out I was between jobs, her patience vanished like a dissipating anesthesia. She wasted no time letting Catherine, and me, know exactly what she thought of my situation. It was a Tuesday night, late enough that the world outside had gone still, the city lights smudged into streaks by the mist on the window. Catherine and I had just settled in for a quiet dinner, takeout Thai food, our favorite. She'd changed into an oversized t-shirt that I loved, hair twisted up with a pencil, her laugh bright and easy. That was when the call came. Ivy's name lit up Catherine's phone, the screen glowing like a warning. Catherine answered with that warm tone she always reserved for her sister. I couldn't hear Ivy's words at first, just the quickening of Catherine's breath, the way her shoulders tensed like a violin string drawn too tight. Then she put the call on speaker, her eyes meeting mine in apology as Ivy's voice filled the room. "You're making a mistake, Catherine," Ivy snapped, each syllable sharp as a scalpel. "You're settling for someone who's short, broke, and outdated. A man who can't even hold down a job? That's not what you deserve. That's not what Dad would want." I felt the air leave my lungs. Short? Broke? Outdated? My mind scrambled to catch up with the words, each one slicing deeper than the last. Catherine tried to cut in, but Ivy wasn't finished. "You always see the best in people, Kathy. But you can't build a future with someone who can't even build a career. He's a liability. He's going to drag you down. You're not his charity case." She didn't know about the fellowship in Berlin. She didn't know about the surgical license tucked safely in my drawer, signed by the best in the field. She didn't know about the 3 offers I'd received just last week. Offers I'd turned down because I wanted to be here with Catherine, to support her while she worked at Westbridge, to build a life with her. Ivy didn't know any of that. She only saw what she wanted to see, a man who hadn't yet unpacked all his boxes, a man who'd taken a sabbatical that didn't fit neatly into her idea of success. I clenched my jaw, staring at the floor like it might offer me some kind of anchor. My heart pounded in my ears, the rhythm of a battle drum I didn't want to fight but couldn't ignore. Catherine's eyes were bright with unshed tears, her hand trembling as she reached for mine. "Julian's more than that, Ivy," she said, her voice breaking just a little. "You don't know him like I do." Ivy scoffed, the sound like a slap. "I know enough. I know he's not the kind of man you should be wasting your time on. You're going places, Catherine. Don't let him hold you back." With that, she ended the call, leaving the room thick with her disapproval, the silence heavy enough to crush us both. Catherine's tears spilled over, and I reached out to catch them with my thumb, my own chest aching. "Don't listen to her," I said, though the words felt hollow. "She doesn't know what we've been through. She doesn't know what we've built. But deep down, I couldn't deny the sting. Because Ivy's words, cruel as they were, struck at something I'd tried so hard to bury. The fear that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't enough. That all the years of training, the all-nighters in med school, the sacrifices, the sleepless nights and steady hands, the lives I'd helped save in Germany, they meant nothing if the people who mattered most couldn't see me. I wanted to tell Ivy about the nights I'd spent on call in Berlin, standing over an operating table while blood soaked through my scrubs, the lives I'd held in my hands like fragile glass. I wanted to tell her about the heart transplant I'd assisted with last spring, about the child whose life I'd helped save, about the head surgeon who'd called me a miracle worker as I slipped out of the OR at dawn. But I couldn't, because she'd already decided who I was. It would have been easy to hate her for that. But as I sat there, holding Catherine's hand, I realized Ivy wasn't the enemy. She was scared. Scared of losing her sister to a man she didn't understand. Scared that I'd fail Catherine. Maybe even scared that she'd fail Catherine, too. And that fear, raw and blinding, was the only language Ivy knew how to speak. So I swallowed my anger, letting it burn in the pit of my stomach like a slow fuse. I would prove myself to her. Not through arguments or explanations, but through actions. I'd show her the man I was, the man I'd become, the man who'd fight for Catherine every single day. Because this wasn't just about proving Ivy wrong. It was about proving to myself that I was more than the label she'd thrown at me. I looked at Catherine, her eyes rimmed red, her cheeks streaked with tears. "I'm not going anywhere," I said, my voice steady now. "I've got offers, Catherine. Berlin, Chicago, even New York. I turned them down because I wanted to be here with you. Because you matter more than any hospital badge or paycheck." She swallowed, her fingers tightening around mine. "I know, Julian," she whispered. "I know." And in that moment, I made a silent vow to myself. Ivy might think this was a game she could win with a single phone call, but she'd underestimated me. She'd underestimated what it meant to love someone like Catherine, to fight for someone who'd handed me her heart all those years ago with nothing but an eraser and a smile. This was a long game, and I intended to play it until the very end. I stood in the lobby of Westbridge University Hospital, clutching the sheaf of documents that would finalize my re-entry into the surgical department. The air smelled of antiseptic and freshly brewed coffee, a scent that always reminded me of long shifts and sleepless nights, of purpose and pain, and the unspoken oath to hold a life in my hands and never let it slip away. I should have felt proud. After all, it wasn't every day that a returning surgeon, one who'd trained under some of Europe's finest, came back to these halls. But as I leaned against the wall, my eyes scanning the crowd of interns, nurses, and doctors bustling by, I felt a different kind of tension in my chest, a dread that coiled tighter with every passing second. I could sense her before I saw her. Ivy, that same polished confidence, that sharp gaze like a hawk scanning for the slightest flaw. She walked with a pack of interns, her white coat crisp and her hair pulled back in a tight ponytail that framed a face equal parts beautiful and severe. She spotted me immediately, her lips curling into a tight, disapproving line, the kind of expression that had greeted me every time she'd visited Catherine's apartment. She made a beeline for me, the interns following like obedient ducklings, their eyes darting between us as though sensing a show about to begin. She stopped a few feet away, her gaze hard. "Why are you here?" she demanded, her voice slicing through the lobby noise like a scalpel. "Following Catherine again?" Her tone dripped with accusation, as if I were some stalker she'd finally cornered. My throat tightened, heat rising to my cheeks. I opened my mouth to respond, but she cut me off, raising her voice so that every doctor, every nurse, every curious intern turned to stare. "You're an NET, a stalker. I'll call security if you don't leave this instant." Her words echoed through the lobby, bouncing off the tiled floor and sterile walls, bouncing around in my skull like bullets. I felt every eye on me, some confused, some suspicious, some smirking at the drama unfolding like an unscripted reality show. My pulse hammered, a cold sweat beating at the back of my neck. I'd faced dying patients, irate families, and the grueling gauntlet of surgical training, but nothing prepared me for the shame that crept up my spine, hot and sticky. I swallowed hard, the words I'd prepared dying in my throat. I could see Catherine's face in my mind, the way she'd look at me with that mix of pride and love that had carried me through my darkest days. I couldn't let Ivy steal that from me. I couldn't let her turn me into the villain of her little story. But before I could speak, a voice rose behind me, firm and calm, like a lifeline thrown into a storm. "Dr. Cross, you forgot your contract." I turned, and there he was, Dr. Langston, the hospital director himself, holding out a folder of papers with a slight smile on his face. His hair was peppered with gray, his eyes sharp and knowing. He was a man who'd seen it all, and right now, he was seeing me. "Everyone," he announced, his voice carrying authority that silenced the entire lobby, "this is Dr. Cross. He'll be resuming surgery next week. One of the finest hands we've trained." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Ivy's face drained of color, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. The interns shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting from me to Dr. Langston and back again, confusion and embarrassment painting their faces. I took the folder from Langston's hand, my fingers trembling only slightly. Relief flooded through me like warm water, washing away the bitter sting of Ivy's accusation. Dr. Langston clapped a hand on my shoulder. "I'm glad you're back," he said, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "We've missed your skill around here." His words felt like a balm, soothing the raw wound Ivy had torn open. I nodded, managing a tight smile, though inside, 1,000 emotions tangled together: anger, vindication, exhaustion. But above all, a renewed sense of purpose. I wasn't here to prove anything to Ivy. I was here for Catherine, for the patients who would trust me with their lives, for the work that made every sleepless night worth it. I turned back to Ivy, who still hadn't found her voice. Her eyes flickered with something, maybe regret, maybe embarrassment, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by that cold, calculating stare. "Dr. Bell," I said, my voice calm, even. "I'll see you in the OR." She blinked, her mouth tightening as if she wanted to say something, anything, but no words came. The interns scattered, their whispers fading as they realized the show was over, the protagonist still standing, dignity intact. As Dr. Langston moved on, I stood there for a moment, letting the adrenaline drain from my veins. I could still feel the heat of every gaze that had turned on me, the echo of Ivy's accusation rattling in my bones. But now, it felt different, less like a condemnation and more like a challenge. I knew who I was. I knew what I'd sacrificed to get here. I wasn't some jobless drifter or at NEET clinging to Catherine's success. I was Dr. Julian Cross, a surgeon who'd fought his way through every obstacle to stand where I was now. And I wasn't going to let Ivy, or anyone, define me by anything less than the work I did and the life I saved. I exhaled slowly, rolling my shoulders back. The lobby felt smaller now, the walls closer, but the shame that had threatened to drown me only minutes before had receded, replaced by a quiet strength. Catherine would hear about this, no doubt. Ivy would spin her version of events, try to salvage her pride. But in the end, it wouldn't matter. Because I had a place here, and not even Ivy's sharpest words could take that away. As I turned toward the elevators, contract in hand, I caught my reflection in the polished glass, a man in a white coat, a man with tired eyes and steady hands, a man who'd earned his place in this world one cut at a time. I thought of Catherine and the eraser she'd given me that day, the beginning of everything, the promise that we'd always be in this together. Ivy didn't know the whole story, but she would. And in time, maybe she'd see me for who I really was. Until then, I'd keep my head down and my hands steady. Because this was a long game, and I intended to play it to the end. The adrenaline rush that carried me through the lobby showdown with Ivy had barely settled before a sharp, urgent voice rang through the hospital's overhead speakers, slicing through the hum of busy corridors like a blade. "Code Blue Cardiology." My stomach dropped. The words echoed in my head, reverberating with a terrifying familiarity. Cardiology. My mind raced to Catherine, who had been in earlier that morning for a routine checkup. She'd mentioned feeling a little off. A dull ache in her chest she brushed off as stress. I'd promised her I'd check in after finalizing my paperwork, but I'd let the confrontation with Ivy distract me. Now, all that mattered was getting to her. My legs moved on instinct, propelling me through the maze of hallways, past nurses clutching clipboards and interns frozen in their tracks. The smell of antiseptic and floor wax mingled with the electric tang of fear that clung to every surface. I skidded around a corner and burst into the cardiac wing, where a group of nurses hovered anxiously outside a room. My heart stuttered at the sight of the crash cart parked at the door, the defibrillator cables trailing like lifelines waiting to be thrown. I pushed my way inside, every cell in my body screaming her name before my lips could form the word. "Catherine." There she was, pale, too still, collapsed on the bed. Her eyes were closed, her lips tinged blue. A nurse was already performing chest compressions, her gloved hands moving in a steady rhythm that felt both too fast and not fast enough. Another nurse fumbled with the AED, her face tight with concentration and panic. "Move," I shouted, my voice hoarse. The nurse looked up, relief flooding her eyes as she recognized me. She stepped aside, and I took her place, my hands finding Catherine's sternum, pressing down, counting compressions as though my entire world hinged on the numbers. And it did. Every second stretched into an eternity. My mind split into two, half the desperate lover praying for a miracle, half the surgeon focusing on the mechanics of saving a life. "Charging," the nurse said, voice trembling as she powered the AED. I kept compressions going until the machine beeped. "Clear," she shouted. I lifted my hands, praying silently. The shock hit her chest, making her body jerk violently. I flinched, but forced myself to keep my eyes on the screen. No rhythm. A flat line. My heart clenched. Again, I barked. I resumed compressions, the sound of my own labored breathing filling the space between the mechanical whine of the AED and the beeping monitors that felt like a countdown to the end. "Charging." The voice was stronger this time, steadier. "Clear." Another shock, another desperate hope. And then, beep. A slow, tentative beat. A flicker of life on the monitor. "Come on, Catherine," I whispered, leaning close, my hands trembling as I felt her pulse under my fingers. It was weak, but it was there. "Stay with me." Her eyelids fluttered, her lips parting just enough to draw in a shallow breath. Tears blurred my vision. Relief threatened to buckle my knees. She was alive, but I knew this wasn't over. The cause of the arrest had to be found, treated, or she'd be back on that table, maybe next time with no second chance. "Get her prepped for immediate surgery," I ordered, my voice firm, my training taking over. The nurses sprang into action, rolling her bed toward the oar, their movements efficient and practiced. "Dr. Cross," one nurse said, her eyes wide with urgency. "Are you?" "Yes," I cut her off. "I'll do it." My hands were already at work, scrubbing in as we moved. Catherine needed me, not just as the man who loved her, but as the surgeon who'd trained for this moment. Berlin's grueling nights, the endless hours in the oar, the cases that no one else wanted, every second had led to this. The procedure we needed was one I'd done a dozen times in Germany, one that hadn't even been fully published in the States yet. The irony hit me like a punch. I'd left her once to learn the very technique that might save her now. Inside the oar, the lights blazed like interrogators, heat and focus bearing down on me. The team moved with a quiet efficiency, the nurses handing me instruments, the anesthesiologist monitoring her vitals. Catherine lay on the table, pale but alive, her heart a fragile metronome that marked every precious second I had left to make this right. I felt the weight of the room's eyes on me, the interns, the nurses, the scrub techs, some familiar, some strangers. I didn't care. All that mattered was her. The incision felt surreal, like cutting through time itself. My hands were steady, each movement precise. I could almost hear my mentors in Berlin in the back of my mind, their voices guiding me through every layer, every vessel, every potential complication. "She's stabilizing," the anesthesiologist said, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. But we weren't out of the woods yet. The damage was worse than I'd hoped, but I refused to let panic take root. This was what I'd trained for. This moment, this patient, this woman. Hours blurred together, time reduced to a series of sutures and clamps, every heartbeat a reminder of why I'd come back, why I'd endured the cold nights in Berlin with nothing but textbooks and stale coffee to keep me company. I wasn't just saving a patient. I was saving the woman I loved, the one who'd handed me an eraser all those years ago and told me we were in this together. When the final suture was placed and her heartbeat strong and steady, I felt a wave of exhaustion and relief crash over me. I stepped back, sweat soaking my scrubs, my hands trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline. She was going to make it. She was going to live. I glanced up at the observation gallery, where a small crowd had gathered, interns, staff, even Ivy. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and wet. For once, she looked less like the accuser and more like a sister. Scared and small, realizing how close she'd come to losing Catherine, I gave her a brief nod before turning my attention back to Catherine. As they wheeled her to recovery, I followed, my heart raw but determined. I wasn't done. I'd stand vigil if I had to, fight every battle that came next, because I'd made her a promise the day we met. We're in this together. And no force on earth, not Ivy's accusations, not the years that had separated us, not even death itself, was going to break that promise. Not while I still had a single breath left to give. Before I rolled Catherine into surgery, before the bright lights of the operating theater bore down on us both, before I let the part of me that was hers get swallowed by the surgeon in me, I felt time slow to a crawl. I was standing at the scrub sink, hands lathered and arms up to my elbows in antiseptic foam, and every moment of the last 2 years flooded back in a single, unrelenting wave. I'd asked her to let me go, to leave her side when she was already so fragile, when every breath she took felt like a gift I couldn't bear to lose. I'd pleaded, in my quiet, desperate way, with all the conviction of a man who'd spent years learning how to ask for nothing. I told her that there was a place in Berlin, a fellowship with the best cardiac surgeons in the world, where I could learn the techniques that might save her. A place where they were developing protocols, trialing procedures not even published yet. She looked at me that night with tears welling up in those soft eyes, her fingers tangling in the fabric of my shirt like she was trying to hold me there by sheer force of will. "I'd rather have 6 months with you than years without you," she'd whispered. The words hit like a scalpel to my chest. But I couldn't stay. I couldn't watch her fade, couldn't bear to be powerless. So I left, and every mile I put between us felt like betrayal wrapped in hope. Berlin was cold in every sense of the word. The first few months, the days blurred into a haze of 12-hour shifts and lessons that made my head spin. Techniques so precise they felt like dance steps, but with stakes that meant one wrong move could end everything. I studied under giants, surgeons who'd pioneered interventions on hearts so damaged they might as well have been glass. I absorbed their every word, every movement, every decision. I watched them save lives that seemed beyond saving. And every time I saw a patient's eyes flutter open, I imagined Catherine's. I imagined her lying in a bed in some sterile room back home, wondering if I'd left her for the thrill of a new city or a bigger name. Every night, after the surgeries and the lectures and the endless rounds, I'd sit in my tiny apartment, phone in hand, thumb hovering over her name. I'd draft messages, but I could never hit send. How could I tell her that the only reason I was there was for her? How could I ask her to understand the selfishness of my decision when I'd left her to fight alone? But every morning, I'd get up, scrub in, and keep learning. I'd study every new paper, every lecture, every case study with a singular focus. Because one day, I knew I'd be back in the room with her, and I'd need every ounce of that training to save her life. And now, standing at the scrub sink in Westbridge, I was about to put it all to the test. The double doors swung open, the hum of the air filling the hallway like a promise and a threat all at once. I met the eyes of the nurses, the anesthesiologist, and the scrub techs, all of them looking to me with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. And then there was Catherine, pale but breathing, her chest rising and falling like the tide. She looked so small on that table, her heart a fragile thing that had already stopped once that day. I stepped inside, the hum of the overhead lights buzzing like static in my ears. I wasn't just a surgeon now. I was a man on a mission. The nurse handed me the scalpel, and for a second, the weight of it felt like the weight of every choice I'd ever made. I glanced at Catherine's face, then at the monitor that displayed her fragile rhythm, and I said it out loud, not just to the team but to myself. "Let's begin." The incision was clean, steady, a practiced movement that belied the chaos inside my head. Every cut, every suture, every clamp was a step on the tightrope between life and death, and I walked it with the precision Berlin had drilled into me. My mind was a steel trap, locked on the task, on the anatomy of her heart that I'd memorized like scripture. Time dissolved. The rhythm of the beeping monitors became the only clock I needed. Her heart was damaged, worse than I'd feared, but the techniques I'd learned overseas gave me a path forward. I worked methodically, my hands moving with a confidence that I'd earned in the dark halls of that German hospital. I could feel her life in my palms, every beat a fragile thread I had to keep from fraying. Halfway through the procedure, I felt the weight of every mile I'd traveled, every night I'd spent alone in a foreign country with nothing but the hope that one day this moment would come. I heard her voice in my head, that night when I'd told her I was leaving. "I'd rather have 6 months with you than years without you." And I'd whispered back, "I'd rather have both." I had to believe that what I'd done, leaving her, was the right choice. That the pain of separation would be worth it if it meant giving her a life beyond 6 months, beyond a year, beyond a lifetime of doctor's visits and medications. I couldn't let the guilt paralyze me now. She needed me. As I finished the final suture, I felt a wave of exhaustion and relief wash over me. I checked the monitor. Her heart was beating strong, steady. I closed my eyes for a second, letting the weight of it sink in. I'd done it. I'd saved her. When I looked up at the team, the nurse met my gaze, her eyes wide with awe. "She's stable," she said softly. The anesthesiologist gave me a tight smile. "Nice work, Dr. Cross." I nodded, swallowing the emotion that threatened to choke me. I wanted to run to her, to hold her hand and tell her everything. About Berlin, about the nights I'd spent wishing I was home, about the promise I'd made to myself to come back better, stronger, enough to save her. But right now, all I could do was watch her be wheeled to recovery. Her life no longer a question mark, but a story still unfolding. This was personal, and I would not fail her. Not now, not ever. Ivy was in the gallery above the operating room, standing behind the glass with a look I'd never seen on her face before, equal parts horror and awe. She'd come to watch, her posture stiff, arms crossed like a fortress around her heart. She'd stood there for hours, watching me cut, sew, connect vessels, rebuild Catherine's heart with the precision I'd learned in Berlin. I didn't look up at her, couldn't, not with my focus so completely on the small, fragile rhythm beneath my hands. But I felt her gaze like a weight, pressing down, demanding answers to all the questions she'd never asked. When it was over and Catherine's heart beat steady beneath the surgical drapes, when I'd closed the final suture and stepped back, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My shoulders ached from the hours of tension. My hands trembled slightly, the tremor of adrenaline finally fading. The team around me began the post-op routine, cleaning up, logging instruments, prepping Catherine for recovery. I peeled off my gloves and turned away, the weight of the surgery finally landing on me. Ivy was waiting for me in the corridor outside the OR. The moment the door swung shut behind me, I saw her, still in her white coat, her hair pinned back, but her eyes were different. They were red-rimmed, the remnants of tears she'd probably wiped away before I could see them. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. For the first time since I'd known her, she was speechless. I braced myself, expecting anger, maybe even another verbal assault. But what came out was something I hadn't expected. Her voice was a whisper, raw and small. "I didn't know," she said, her gaze dropping to the floor as though she couldn't bear to meet my eyes. "I thought you abandoned her." I stood there, arms crossed over my chest, my own heart still beating too fast. I wanted to be angry, to throw every accusation back at her. About the things she'd said, the names she'd called me, the way she treated me like a parasite feeding off her sister's success. But looking at her now, she didn't look like the Ivy who had sneered at me in the cafe, who'd called me an NEET in the hospital lobby. She looked like a sister who'd almost lost the only family she had. "She didn't want you to worry," I said finally, my voice even but not unkind. "She didn't want to scare you with how sick she really was." Ivy blinked, her eyes filling with tears again. She shook her head, a small, helpless gesture that made her seem so young. "But I'm her sister," she whispered. "I should have known. I should have." "You do now," I interrupted, stepping closer. I placed a hand on her shoulder, steady but gentle, like I would with a patient who needed more than medicine. "You know now, Ivy. That's what matters." Her shoulders sagged, and she finally met my eyes. "You saved her," she said. The words were so quiet I barely heard them. You didn't just save her. God, I was so wrong about you." I felt something loosen in my chest, like a knot that had been there for years finally giving way. "Yeah," I said softly. "You were." She gave a short, shaky laugh that turned into a sob, and I let her have that moment, let her break down in the way she needed to. I'd hated her once, hated the way she judged me without knowing the battles I'd fought. But standing there, seeing the rawness in her face, I realized that hate was just fear wearing a different mask. Ivy was terrified of losing Catherine, and maybe that's what had driven her to push me away, to protect her sister from a man she didn't understand. "I don't know how to make this right," she said, her voice cracking. "I've been so awful. I just wanted to protect her." "I know," I said. "And you did. In your own way." I squeezed her shoulder. "But now it's time to let me do that too." She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks, and for the first time, she didn't look like my enemy. She looked like Catherine's sister, like someone who'd walked through fire for the people she loved. And maybe that's what we had in common. I want to start over, she said. The words trembled, like she was scared they'd shatter. I met her gaze, feeling a quiet strength settle into my bones. Then let's start over, I said. She managed a watery smile. Julian, she said, and it was the first time she'd said my name without a trace of bitterness. Thank you. I smiled back, exhaustion tugging at the edges of my vision, but a warmth filling my chest. You're welcome, I said. We stood there for a moment, the hum of the hospital around us, the promise of second chances hanging in the air. I knew it wouldn't be easy. Bridges burned by anger and misunderstanding don't rebuild overnight. But at least the first brick had been laid. The surgical team wheeled Catherine past us, her face pale but peaceful, tubes and monitors trailing like lifelines. Ivy's eyes followed her sister, her lips moving in a silent prayer. I stepped forward, walking beside the gurney, my own hand finding Catherine's, cool and small in my grasp. You're going to be okay, I whispered, more to myself than to her. I've got you. And as the doors swung open to the recovery ward, I felt Ivy at my side, not as an adversary, but as an ally. The thought made me stand a little taller. I'd come back for Catherine, but maybe I'd come back for Ivy too, for the family we were all trying to rebuild in the shadows of old wounds. As the nurse led us through the doors, I cast one last glance at Ivy. She nodded, a silent promise in her eyes. We were in this together now, doctors, sisters, lovers. And for the first time in a long time, I believed we could actually win. Catherine's recovery was slow but steady, and I took every small victory like a precious gift. The first time she opened her eyes and recognized me, I felt like I'd climbed out of a grave. Her voice was a scratchy whisper, but the smile she gave me was all the light I needed. She squeezed my hand with a strength that defied the fragile lines snaking from her arms, and in that moment, I swore I'd never let her slip away again. Ivy visited every day. At first, she'd stand stiffly in the doorway, as if she wasn't sure she belonged there. But over time, the lines in her forehead softened. She'd bring flowers from the hospital gift shop, daisies, sunflowers, anything that looked like hope, and set them in the corner with a nervous smile. Sometimes she'd read to Catherine from her medical notes, slipping into that big sister mode that made even the stiffest textbooks sound like bedtime stories. Other times, she'd ask me questions, her eyes bright with curiosity that had nothing to do with judgment anymore. Julian, she'd say, her notebook balanced on her knee. What did you use for the bypass graft? A radial artery, I'd reply, and her eyes would widen. That's incredible, she'd say, scribbling notes like a student in a lecture hall. You're a genius. I'd laugh, a short, tired sound. Just a surgeon, I'd say. But every time, a warmth spread in my chest that hadn't been there before. Ivy even started calling me by my first name, Julian, without the acidic bite it used to carry. She'd ask about techniques, about Berlin, about the cases I'd seen there. Sometimes she'd linger in the hallway long after her shift, peppering me with questions about heart-lung machines and post-op protocols. And when I answered, I saw the walls she'd built around herself start to crumble. She wasn't just Catherine's sister anymore. She was a resident hungry to learn, and I realized she'd been fighting her own battles long before I'd walked into her life. The interns, too, began to see me differently. At first, they'd watch me from a distance, the label of NET still clinging like an unwanted second skin. But once they saw me scrub in, once they saw the way my hands moved in the oar, the way I anticipated complications and handled them with a calm they hadn't expected, everything changed. They started asking for my input on cases, inviting me to lunch in the cafeteria, even sharing jokes in the break room. Dr. Cross, one of them said as I passed by the nurse's station, I saw your technique on the triple bypass last night. I hope you don't mind if I borrow a few of your moves. Borrow all you want, I told him, a grin tugging at my lips. That's what learning is about. And it was. Every time I taught an intern or answered Ivy's questions, I felt like I was giving back, like the pain I'd carried for so long was finally transforming into something useful. Director Langston, meanwhile, made sure I was busy, maybe too busy. He assigned me the most complicated cases, the longest surgeries, the high-profile consults that the hospital used to lure in wealthy donors. He'd grin at me during morning rounds like a proud uncle cashing in on his favorite nephew's talents. Dr. Cross, he'd say, slapping me on the back. Can you handle the aortic dissection this afternoon? The governor's wife is in town, and I'd hate to send her anywhere else. Of course, I'd reply, even though I'd barely slept the night before. And every time, I delivered. Because no matter how exhausted I was, no matter how heavy the weight of expectations felt, I remembered that I'd come back for Catherine, and every life I saved was another reason I'd made the right choice. Catherine's progress was slow but undeniable. She started sitting up in bed, her color returning, the shadows fading from beneath her eyes. She'd smile at me with that same warmth I'd fallen in love with, and every time, it felt like a sunrise breaking over the horizon. "You didn't just save my life," she whispered one afternoon as I sat by her bed, holding her hand. "You made me want to live it fully." Her words hit me like a defibrillator jolt. I'd spent so long fighting for her, for my place in this hospital, for respect from Ivy and the interns, and even myself, that I'd forgotten what it was all for. It was for this moment. For her. For us. I brought her home as soon as she was stable enough to leave the hospital. Ivy came over every day at first, helping with medications, checking vitals, even making dinner when I was too tired to think. We'd sit in the living room, Catherine curled up on the couch, Ivy on the floor with her notes, and me perched on the armrest like a sentry. Sometimes Catherine would fall asleep mid-sentence, her head tilting against the cushions, her breathing soft and steady. Ivy would look up at me, her eyes thoughtful. "You know," she said one night, her voice low, "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad you're here." I looked at her, surprised by the softness in her tone. "Me too," I said, and I meant it. Because through all the battles, the surgeries, the accusations, the nights I'd spent alone in Berlin, I'd never stopped believing that coming back to Catherine was the right choice. That saving her was worth every mile I'd traveled and every sleepless night I'd endured. And now, in the quiet of our home, with Ivy laughing at a TV show she'd once called childish and Catherine sleeping with her hand in mine, I finally understood what she'd meant all those years ago when she'd lent me that eraser. We were in this together. Always. "You're the only reason I came back," I told her the next morning, pressing a kiss to her forehead as she stirred. She smiled, her eyes half-lidded with sleep but full of trust. "And I'm the only reason you're staying." I kissed her again, my heart light and certain. "Exactly," I whispered. And I knew, without a doubt, that this messy, imperfect, beautiful life was exactly where I was meant to be. One morning, just as the sun cracked the horizon and spilled golden light across the hospital courtyard, Ivy knocked on my office door. She ditched the usual sharpness that made her look twice her age and instead wore an expression that hovered between fear and anticipation. "Big bro," she said. Her voice barely above a whisper, like she'd spent the entire walk rehearsing those two words. "Want to help me prep for my first assist?" I almost laughed. "Big bro," she'd said, as though I'd always been here. As though the months of tension, the accusations, the hospital lobby showdown hadn't happened. But the warmth in her eyes was different now, less guarded, more open. She wanted my help, not because she had to, but because she knew I'd give it honestly. "Of course," I said, leaning back in my chair, smiling. "Let's walk through it." She beamed, a small, cautious smile, like a flower opening to the sun. She pulled out a battered notebook, the edges frayed from nights of studying. I took it from her, scanning her notes, her carefully scribbled diagrams. "Not bad," I said, pointing to a particular step she'd highlighted. "But when you clamp here, be prepared for more bleeding than you'd think. It's easy to underestimate." Her brow furrowed. "But the textbooks are written by people who've never stood in the or with a patient's life in their hands," I interrupted, giving her a gentle nudge with my elbow. "Real life is messy. That's why you're here, to learn from someone who's been in that mess." She let out a breath, her eyes shining with something like relief. "Thanks, Julian," she said, using my name the way she'd started to more often lately. Like it was no longer an accusation but a sign of respect. Later that afternoon, after rounds, I met Catherine in the hospital garden. She was sitting under a sprawling oak tree, her hair caught in the breeze like 1,000 tiny flags. She looked healthier than she had in weeks, color in her cheeks, a spark in her eyes that made me feel like we'd stolen something precious back from the universe. "Hey," I said, dropping beside her on the bench. "Guess who's assisting me tomorrow?" She looked at me with that knowing smile, the one that always made my heart skip. "Ivy." I laughed. "Yeah, she actually asked for my help this morning." Her eyes softened, pride mingling with relief. "She's finally seeing you," she said. "The real you." I stared at her, at the way the sunlight danced in her hair, at the strength in her posture, at the soft curve of her lips. "You always saw me," I said. She reached over, threading her fingers through mine. I always believed in you, she corrected. There's a difference. I squeezed her hand, and for a moment the world felt like it had shrunk to just us, the garden, the breeze, and the weight of everything we'd survived. Do you remember the eraser? She asked suddenly, her voice catching on a memory that felt like it belonged to another life. I smiled. I remember everything. She turned to face me fully now, eyes bright and searching. You became a surgeon for me, didn't you? I took a breath. It was a question I'd asked myself 1,000 times in Berlin, in the middle of the night when the loneliness got too loud. No, I said slowly, choosing each word like a scalpel. I became a surgeon because of you. She blinked, a tear sliding down her cheek. What's the difference? I reached up and brushed it away with my thumb. Because of you, I learned what it meant to fight for someone, I said. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Because the thought of losing you was the only thing scarier than any or. Her lips trembled. Julian, because of you. I continued, my voice rough. I learned that every heartbeat is a promise. Every breath is a gift. I never wanted to be just another doctor. I wanted to be the doctor who would never let you down. She leaned into my shoulder, her head fitting into that space that had always felt like it was made for her. I wrapped my arm around her, pulling her close. Her heartbeat thrummed against my ribs, steady and sure, like a reminder of every mile I'd traveled, every night I'd spent alone in Berlin, every argument, every apology. Let's not waste any more time, she whispered, her breath warm against my neck. We won't, I promised, pressing my lips to her hair. The next day, Ivy stood beside me in the OR, her eyes steady, her hands trembling only slightly. I watched her the way I'd watched countless interns before, but this was different. This was family, messy, complicated, but real. Her gloved hands hovered over the instruments, waiting for my cue. Ready? I asked. She nodded, her jaw set in determination. Then let's make history, I said, and she cracked a grin that was all bell confidence. We worked side by side for hours, every movement a dance of trust and precision. She asked smart questions, her voice calm, her focus unwavering. Every time she glanced at me, I saw something shift. A respect that hadn't been there before, a recognition that I was more than the label she'd given me. When the final suture was placed and the patient was stable, Ivy turned to me, her eyes shining with triumph and relief. That was incredible, she said, her voice hoarse from the hours of concentration. I smiled. You did well. She let out a shaky laugh. I couldn't have done it without you. I reached out and rested a hand on her shoulder. That's what family's for, I said. After we scrubbed out, she pulled me into a quick hug, awkward, stiff, but real. Thank you, she whispered. I watched her walk away, her head high, her step sure. For the first time since I'd met her, I didn't see an enemy. I saw a sister, a colleague, someone I'd fight for as fiercely as I'd fought for Catherine. Later that night, I sat on the hospital steps, the cool air brushing against my face. Catherine found me there, her hair loose, her smile soft. She sat beside me, her shoulder pressing into mine. How is it? She asked, her eyes curious. I let out a long breath. She's good, I said. Really good. She grinned. I always knew she was. I shook my head. No, Catherine. She's more than good. She's family. She leaned over and kissed me, her lips warm and certain. So are you, she said. And in that moment, under the stars and the hush of a hospital that never really slept, I felt something inside me settle. The NET they'd called me, the jobless stalker Ivy had once dismissed, he was gone. In his place stood Dr. Julian Cross, surgeon, brother, lover. And for the first time, I wasn't fighting to prove myself. I was fighting to keep the promises I'd made to the woman who'd given me an eraser, a smile, and a reason to be more than I'd ever imagined. Catherine returned to her outpatient work at the hospital, her face glowing with a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. Watching her step back into her world, steady and unafraid, filled me with a pride so fierce it almost startled me. She'd fought her way back, through the darkness, the silence, the moment her heart had almost given up. And every time I saw her greet a patient, her eyes warm and her smile unwavering, I remembered why I'd come home. Ivy was a force in her own right, now a standout resident under my mentorship. She absorbed every lesson with a hunger I hadn't seen in her before, her questions sharp, but no longer laced with accusation. Sometimes she'd corner me after rounds, her notes filled with scribbles that danced between medical jargon and raw curiosity. Julian, she'd say, her voice all business, how would you approach a patient with restrictive cardiomyopathy? I'd grin and walk her through the steps, and when she'd scribble down the answer, I'd see the gratitude in her eyes. The other interns had started looking to me for guidance too. Morning rounds felt different now. I no longer felt like an outsider. The NET they'd laughed at, now I led the discussion, my white coat marked with the respect I'd earned. Dr. Cross, they'd say, eyes bright, voices eager. Can you walk us through that case from last night? The one with the subaortic membrane. And I would, because that's what being a leader meant. Showing them that every patient was a chance to learn, to fight, to heal. Sometimes Ivy would stand beside me, her brow furrowed as she listened. She'd chime in with questions of her own, thoughtful, precise, and every time, I'd feel a flicker of pride. She wasn't just Catherine's sister anymore. She was my colleague, my partner in the my friend. As for me, I no longer needed validation. I'd found it in every heartbeat I'd helped steady, every life I'd had the privilege to save. Catherine and I would sit in the garden during our breaks, sharing coffee and quiet laughter, and every time I looked at her, I knew I'd already won. She'd reach for my hand, her fingers warm and strong, and say, "You made it back to me." And I'd smile, because it was true. One morning, I woke up beside her in our apartment, the sun just beginning to warm the world outside. She turned to me, her eyes sleepy but bright, and whispered, "You know, I still have that eraser." I laughed softly, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I know," I said. "It's why I never gave up." She snuggled closer, her head resting on my chest, and in that moment I felt the weight of every challenge we'd faced, every scar we'd earned, melt away. We'd survived. We'd built something stronger than the doubts, the distance, the labels that had once defined us. At the hospital, I found myself leading by example. Long surgeries that tested my skill, consults that demanded every ounce of empathy I'd learned from Berlin to Bramwell. Patients would grab my hand and say, "Thank you, doctor," and I'd smile, knowing that this was the only validation I'd ever need. Ivy thrived, too. She presented a case study at a regional conference, her voice strong, her slides impeccable, and when she saw me in the audience, she beamed. "This one's for you, Julian," she'd said. And I'd felt a warmth I hadn't known I needed. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned the color of a healing bruise, Catherine and I sat on the hospital roof, the city lights flickering to life below. She took my hand in hers and said, "You know, you're not that man they call the NET anymore." I turned to her, my chest tightening. "I was never that man," I said, "but I had to prove it. To myself, to Ivy, to everyone who thought they knew me." She smiled, her eyes reflecting the lights of the city. "And now, I said, pressing my forehead to hers, "I don't have to prove anything. Not to anyone." She laughed, a soft sound that made my heart ache with love. "You never did." I closed my eyes, breathing her in, feeling the strength of her heart beating against my chest. I'd faced every doubt, every accusation, every whispered word meant to break me, and I'd come out stronger. The man who'd walked into that cafe with Ivy's harsh words ringing in his ears was gone. The man who'd stood in the lobby while she called me a NET, that man had found his place. Because every time I saw Catherine smile, every time I heard Ivy's voice calling me Julian, every time an intern met my eyes with respect instead of pity, I knew I'd already won. And every day, when I held the woman who first lent me an eraser and later gave me her heart, I made one silent vow: I will never let her heart break again.